Ever wonder what invisible force really fueled the titans of industry? The Carnegies, mountains of steel, the Rockefellers, seas of oil. The answer, well, is surprisingly simple, yet so powerful. Money. And in the late 1800s, one man controlled more of it than pretty much anyone else. John Pierpont Morgan. It's easy to forget now, but America back then was basically an emerging market, heavily dependent on British capital. But this unique mix of timing, genius, and connections allowed Morgan to become the most powerful figure in American finance. So how did one man wield that much incredible power? How did he shape an entire nation's economy? That's what we're going to unpack in this deep dive. And honestly, some of what we found is truly astonishing. We'll explore how Morgan shaped the very foundation of the American economy, for better or for worse. And what his story can tell us about power, influence, and those really critical moments when a nation's future just hangs in the balance. Okay, so John Pierpont Morgan, born April 17th, 1837. And he was born into a truly privileged life. Every advantage you could think of. His grandfather, John Pierpont, was this radical, fiery preacher. Definitely taught him the power of forceful speaking.
Oh yeah, a skill that would absolutely serve him well later on.
But the really towering figure, the instrumental one in Pierpont's life, that was his father, Junius Spencer Morgan.
Right. Junius was hugely respected, banking, both in America and Europe.
And he really took it upon himself, didn't he? Shaping his son, Pierpont, into his own image. Composed, shrewd.
Grooming him with tough love, basically, for the family banking business.
So you'd think, okay, silver spoon, smooth path ahead. But his early life had some, well, surprising challenges.
Absolutely. That's often overlooked. Despite all that privilege, Pierpont was actually a sickly child. As an infant, seizures. Later on, rheumatic fever, scarlet fever, these painful migraines.
Wow.
But the most visible thing, certainly, was his acne rosacea. It severely inflamed the blood vessels in his nose, making it, well, a disfigured sort of red and purple monstrosity.
You wouldn't always know from pictures, though.
No. He famously demanded his nose be touched up in portraits, photos. It was like the 1800s version of Photoshop.
That's amazing.
But what's really insightful here, I think, is how this forced isolation, it didn't necessarily hinder him, it sharpened his focus, allowed him to just immerse himself in complex financial statements from a young age. That solitude paradoxically cultivated his unique analytical edge.
That's a fascinating point. So he couldn't play outside, much like other kids. He stayed inside, studied, learned to read financial statements. And when he wasn't absorbing information, he apparently found comfort playing solitaire.
Yeah, that became a lifelong pleasure for him.
But even in the classroom, he stood out, a natural leader, apparently.
He challenged teachers, used logic to kind of talk them down from punishing him.
Clever kid.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, his childhood fascination with figures like Napoleon, it wasn't just admiration, it was like an early blueprint for his own, insatiable drive for consolidation, for control. It transformed him from just a financier into an architect of whole industries.
So that fascination led him to collect autographs. Presidents, other famous people.
Exactly. And he wrote a school essay on Napoleon Bonaparte, heavily inspired by the general's appetite for global power. So yeah, these early experiences, from the illness to the ambition, they really started shaping the foundations of his financial genius.
So after this, let's say, formative childhood, Pierpont starts his career. Wall Street, an unpaid clerk. Right. Small banking firm in New York. His father helped him get the position.
Yep. And one of his main jobs was providing overseas intelligence back to Junius in London, sending the latest American economic, political updates. He'd write these long letters every Tuesday and Friday evening for like 33 years.
Oh, dang.
Junius cherished them, but Pierpont's ambition, it quickly outgrew that small firm.
Right. So in 1861, he starts his own company, J. Pierpont Morgan and Company. So, okay, his financial career is just starting to take off. What about his personal life around this really pivotal time?
Well, his new role on Wall Street definitely put him in touch with New York's elite, and that's where he met Amelia Sturgis, Mimi.
Mimi.
They had this fierce love affair, inseparable for 3 years. But then tragedy struck. Mimi developed this lingering cough. Tuberculosis, it turned out.
Oh, no.
Despite her being so sick, Pierpont rushed to marry her. October 1861. He actually had to carry her down the stairs for the ceremony.
Heartbreaking.
They went on this long honeymoon, Algiers. He hired the best doctors money could buy, but her condition just got worse. She died just 4 months after their wedding.
Only 4 months. Wow.
And that profound loss, it deeply impacted him. It really drove him to just throw himself wholeheartedly into his work. building his reputation as this trustworthy American banker.
What a tragic start to his adult life. And then right as he's starting his own firm, the nation plunges into the Civil War. It's pretty wild to think how someone like him, so ambitious, would navigate that kind of turmoil, especially when, well, there were fortunes to be made even amid the conflict.
Oh, definitely. And like other wealthy men, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Morgan paid $300 for a substitute to avoid enlistment.
Right, he called him the other Pierpont Morgan.
Yeah. But he wasn't idle. He found ways to profit from the carnage. Trading Union bonds was one way.
How did that work?
He realized prices would seesaw based on battle outcomes. If you could predict the winner, you could make big profits.
Smart, if ruthless.
And then there was the infamous Hull-Carbine affair in 1863.
Ah, yes. Tell us about that.
He loaned $20,000 to buy 5,000 old antiquated rifles for about $3.50 each.
Okay.
They were then modernized slightly, cost maybe $1.75 each for the upgrade. Then, the Union Army, desperate after a defeat, bought these same modified rifles back for a steep $22 each.
$22, that's quite a markup.
It was. 2 years later, a congressional committee investigated and labeled those involved in the deal as being worse than a traitor.
Strong words indeed. Didn't sit well with his father, I imagine.
No, definitely not. This kind of speculative deal clashed hard with Junius's philosophy. Remember, Junius lived through the Panic of 1857.
Right, the banking crisis.
Exactly. It made him deeply cautious about reckless speculation. His motto was, "Slow and sure should be the motto of every man."
Quite the contrast to Pierpont's wartime activities.
But despite all the deal-making, Pierpont always made time for religion. It was actually at St. George's Church in Manhattan that he met Frances Louisa Tracy, or Fanny.
His second wife.
Correct. They married on May 31st, 1865. 9 months later, his first daughter, Louisa, was born, and then his first son, J.P. Morgan Jr., followed 2 years after that.
So the Civil War ends. America enters this multi-decade boom period. The Gilded Age, the Age of Enterprise.
Right. 1870 to 1910, roughly. Population doubles, income doubles. Robber barons and business tycoons really take over.
And as the country grew, so did its need for capital.
Huge need for capital.
And Morgan, backed by his father's old world money in London, perfectly positioned on Wall Street.
It really was the epitome of being in the right place at the right time.
But here's a surprising twist.
Yeah.
At age 33, apparently, Morgan was tired, exhausted, actually considering retirement to sort of cure his weary body.
Get out. Really? At 33?
Yep. But his father, Junius, would have none of it.
Dad steps in again.
Junius arranges a new partnership. Anthony Drexel, older, wiser Philadelphia banker, strong London ties.
Drexel Morgan and Company, formed in 1871.
Exactly. And Junius put up $5 million in seed capital.
Wow. So what did Morgan say?
He agreed to join, but only on one condition.
Which was?
A desperately needed vacation. And apparently this became a habit. He'd regularly take several months off each year.
Months off. In that era.
Yeah, he joked he could do 12 months of work in just 9 months' time.
Huh. That's really interesting. How do you think that unconventional approach, that rest, affected his effectiveness, his longevity in such a brutal field?
That's a great question. You rarely hear about titans taking months off. Maybe gave him perspective, avoided burnout.
Could be. Gave him mental space his competitors lacked. He'd return refreshed, maybe with a broader view.
Makes sense. And beyond his financial genius, his success was also tied to his imposing image.
Oh, yeah. That nose, the acne rosacea made it even more prominent, bulbous, deformed.
And his gaze. Described as like staring into the light of an oncoming train. Fierce.
Plus, he was tall for the time. 6'2". That's a full 8 inches over the average man back then. He towered over people.
And he used that daunting appearance, didn't he, to bend opponents to his will. Especially in that critical railroad industry.
Definitely. The railroads were booming, but also wildly overexpanded, cutthroat competition everywhere.
Right. Unlike other industries getting monopolized, railroads had tons of competitors driving down margins.
But where others saw chaos, Morgan saw opportunity.
Instead of just owning stock passively.
He took an active role, got on the board, reshuffled leadership, directed the company himself.
Which became known as Morganization.
Exactly. What we'd call activist investing today.
And the saying went, wherever Pierpont sat, that was the head of the table, regardless of his official title.
Right. And remember that famous quote when a railroad president challenged him?
Oh, yeah. Never forget, your railroads belong to my clients. Ice cold.
Totally. But over time, he also gained this reputation as an honest, forthright dealmaker. They called him the sheriff in the Wild West of trains.
Because there were no real government regulatory agencies back then.
Precisely. So this focus on consolidation, on control, not just financing, that was a real departure. It cemented his reputation as this powerful force.
And you know the phrase, work hard, play hard? Morgan really lived it.
Oh, the yacht, the Corsair.
Yep, 1882, 185-foot iron yacht, commuted on it sometimes, hosted huge parties.
But it wasn't just for fun, right? He used it for business, too. Eccentric boardroom, you might say.
Definitely eccentric. Remember the Corsair Pact?
Vaguely. Refresh my memory.
Okay, two huge railroads, the Pennsylvania and the New York Central, battling each other fiercely,
Okay.
threatening to crash the entire American economy because they were so big, like 2/3 of all publicly traded companies at the time.
Wow. High stakes.
So Morgan comes up with this audacious plan, invites both presidents onto the Corsair.
On the yacht, okay?
And then, in typical Morgan style, he refuses to dock the yacht until they agree to his terms.
No way. He held them hostage.
Effectively, yes. Can you imagine? Eventually, they wearily agreed. Stay out of each other's territories.
Unbelievable. That's bold.
Became known as the Corsair Pact. He got a $100,000 commission, plus $1 million profit on his rail bonds from the deal stabilizing things.
Incredible story. And just a few years after that, another big event, April 1890.
His father's death.
Yeah, Junius died tragically in a carriage accident. Painful for Pierpont, of course, but also maybe liberating.
How so?
He inherited the bulk of the fortune, $15 million, doubled his wealth overnight.
Ah, so no more Junies looking over his shoulder.
Exactly. Free to invest, spend as he pleased, finally stepping out of that shadow.
And his first order of business.
Immediately buy an even bigger yacht, creatively named the Corsair II.
Of course. And that's where the famous quote comes from, right?
Legend has it, yeah. Someone asked about the cost. He supposedly replied, if you have to ask, you can't afford it.
Classic Morgan. Though he had plenty of cash, personally, the market was about to cause trouble again.
Right. Enter the gold panic of 1893.
Explain the context there, the gold standard.
Okay, so back then, the US dollar was tied to gold. Every paper dollar was backed by a specific amount of physical gold held by the government.
Stable system, but inflexible. You couldn't just print more money.
Exactly. And the government had a minimum gold reserve they were supposed to maintain, around $100 million.
But in February 93, those reserves plunged.
Plummeted, sparked widespread panic. People started asking, is this paper money actually worth anything?
Confidence crisis.
Huge. Reserves draining, banks folding, businesses collapsing, millions unemployed. This period was actually originally called the Great Depression.
Wow. Before the 1930s one.
Yep. And major corporations, especially the railroads Morgan loved, turned to Wall Street bankers. J.P. Morgan, mainly.
His darling industry, the rails, collapsing again. 192 lines bankrupt in 1 year.
A third of all tracks shuttered. It was bad.
So when the railroads came asking for help?
He refused, unless they gave him full control.
Full control. Again.
Then he used his financial wizardry. Strengthened balance sheets, refinanced debt, issued new shares, slowly pulled the brakes on the chaos.
And his reward.
A secure hold on all their future business. Plus, some very handsome commissions, naturally.
This growing reputation, this power, eventually put him face to face with the president, right?
It did. Pierpont had managed the railroad part of the crisis, but the U.S. Treasury itself was still in dire straits, gold reserves crumbling.
So Morgan comes up with a plan, sends it to President Grover Cleveland.
Confident he'd get a yes. Instead, within an hour, the reply was no.
Ouch. What was Cleveland's plan?
Sell bonds to the public. Morgan knew that would take way too long. The government faced default within weeks.
So Morgan doesn't wait.
Nope. Rushes from New York to Washington,
Huh.
determined to meet Cleveland, a man he considered his equal.
Bold move.
At first, Cleveland refused to see him. Pierpont apparently replied intensely, I have come down to Washington to see the president, and I'm going to stay here until I see him.
He wasn't backing down.
Not a chance. The situation was desperate. $2 million a day leaking from gold reserves.
Dire.
The morning after Morgan arrives, the treasurer gets a call. Reserves down to just $9 million.
$9 million.
Pierpont saw his opening. Tells the men in the room he personally knows of a draft for $12 million, if it's presented that day.
It wipes out the U.S. government's remaining gold by 3 p.m.
Exactly. Cleveland, realizing how bad it is, asks, Have you anything to suggest, Mr. Morgan?
The moment he was waiting for.
Absolutely. Morgan proposes his syndicate, U.S. and European investors. They'd buy gold from the Treasury using this obscure loophole from an old Civil War law.
A loophole.
Yeah, a provision allowing the Treasury to sell bonds directly to private parties in an emergency,
Whoa.
crucially bypassing Congress, which could be slow and political.
Clever? Did Cleveland agree?
He signed the contract. The bonds were sold incredibly fast. 22 minutes in New York, 2 hours in London. Disaster averted.
Morgan bailed out the United States government. Rescued the country.
He did. But here's where it gets really interesting.
The commission.
The hefty commission he pocketed for his services. Which immediately raises that question. Was he acting more like a profiteer than a patriot?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Or maybe the billion-dollar question, given the stakes. On one hand, yeah, huge profit. But on the other, contemporary accounts often praised his decisive action. Without him, the economic fallout could have been catastrophic. How do you square those two things?
It's such a classic Gilded Age dilemma, isn't it? He undeniably profited, hugely. But his actions also highlight this critical truth. Back then, without strong government mechanisms, private capital, even if self-serving, often became the de facto national stabilizer.
It really blurs the lines between personal gain and public service.
Totally. And with this immense influence, people were getting worried. Should one man like Morgan hold that much power?
And there's no clearer example of that concentrated power than the U.S. Steel deal.
1901. Andrew Carnegie.
Right. Carnegie Steel's at its peak, but Carnegie wants to retire. Writes his price on a scrap of paper, $480 million.
$480 million, just like that.
Morgan takes one look, agrees on the spot. Largest business transaction in history up to that point.
Incredible. Carnegie later said he should have asked for another $100 million.
And Morgan apparently replied, if you had, I would have paid it. Just total confidence.
Wow. So using Carnegie Steel, Morgan forms U.S. Steel Corporation.
The world's first billion-dollar company, valued at $1.4 billion. That was like 7% of America's entire GDP at the time.
7%. Unbelievable. Controlling 60 to 70% of the country's steel production.
And through another company, Northern Securities, he owned a third of all rail lines.
At a time when railroads were, 60% of the stock market's capitalization.
Exactly. So people started whispering, maybe Morgan actually owned the United States.
And one person who seemed to believe those whispers was the president himself. Theodore Roosevelt.
TR. A different kind of president.
Very different. Fiercely anti-monopoly. Believed government needed to grow alongside industry to keep it in check.
So he goes after Morgan.
Yep. Uses the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. Targets Northern Securities, U.S. Steel. Wants to make an example of Morgan.
How did he announce it?
Publicly declared Northern Securities was under investigation. Didn't even consult his cabinet first.
Bold move. Morgan must have been furious.
Oh, yeah. For the second time in his life, Morgan rushes to the White House, demanding to see the president.
Deja vu.
He apparently complained he should have been consulted, given time to fix the problem himself.
And Roosevelt's reply.
Direct. That is precisely what we did not want you to do.
Oof, burn.
Northern Securities was eventually broken up by the Supreme Court in 1904. Morgan was bitter.
I bet. Didn't he say something about Roosevelt going hunting?
He did. Heard Roosevelt was going to Africa to hunt. Pierpont reportedly remarked, "Good. I hope the first lion that meets him does his duty."
That is quite a quip. Savage.
But even though they clash, Roosevelt had to admit Morgan had a talent for fixing economies.
Which would be needed again soon. The panic of 1907.
Right. Stock market panics after a copper company fails. Drags down the mining industry, brokerage houses, a bank, all in one weekend. Another bank run starts.
So Roosevelt
Sets aside his differences, calls Morgan, extends $25 million of government funds for Pierpont to use as he sees fit.
Wow, even John D. Rockefeller offered help.
Offered half his personal fortune, yeah. The stakes were that high again.
So what did Morgan do this time? Another bold move.
Classic Morgan. Gathers the heads of the biggest banks and trusts in his private library.
Yeah.
Lays out his plan for organizing the capital to bail out the failing banks. Then he reportedly locks the door and starts playing solitaire until they all reach a resolution, just like the Corsair Pact.
That's incredible. Did it work?
By early morning, they had a deal. Morgan organized the capital, another crisis averted. J.P. Morgan hailed a hero again.
Amazing. But that was kind of the end of an era, wasn't it?
It really was. The very last time one man, especially a Wall Street banker, would hold that much singular influence over the entire country, change was coming.
And that change started to formalize pretty soon after, with the Pujo Committee?
Great. 1912, a Senate-led investigation looking into the huge financial power held by just a handful of bankers. Morgan was the main target.
We had to testify.
He did. And
Okay.
there's that famous moment they asked him if commercial credit is based on money or property.
And his reply.
Clever, he says. No, sir. The first thing is character, before money or anything else.
Character. The room applauded, apparently.
They did. Smooth move, but ultimately the committee's findings were stark.
What did they find?
That Morgan single-handedly controlled over $22 billion in capital through 112 corporations, 341 directorships. It represented more than 2/3 of the country's GDP at the time.
2/3. Just staggering.
While he wasn't found guilty of anything illegal, the Pujo Committee really paved the way for major changes.
Like the Federal Reserve.
Exactly. And the permanent fixture of income taxes. It marked a turning point, really, the end of that era where immense financial power could operate largely unchecked by government.
So he helped America avoid multiple economic depressions. But he couldn't escape his own personal struggles, could he?
No, it seems not. He apparently suffered from nervous breakdowns throughout his career.
Really? He always seems so imposing.
That was the image, but internally. Grew increasingly anxious as he got wealthier, argued he had more to worry about losing, not just for himself, but for his clients.
The weight of it all.
Yeah. He'd confine himself to bed for several days each month just to recover.
And despite being seen as this tough banker, he was actually quite thin-skinned.
Hated the greedy monster portrayals in the newspapers.
And in his final years, that lifestyle.
Yeah, lived to excess, draining massive amounts of sherry and port, smoking dozens of cigars a day.
Eating breakfast that would kill a horse.
Right. Not exactly healthy living.
And then there's the Titanic connection.
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting footnote. He owned the Titanic through his shipping trust, International Mercantile Marine.
And he was supposed to be on its maiden voyage.
He was, him and his huge art collection. But apparently it was just a last-minute fluke, some illness or change of plans that kept him off the ship when it went down in 1912.
Wow. A close call.
Very.
But maybe it was all just too much for the 75-year-old Titan in the end.
Seems likely. While traveling in Rome, March 31st, 1913, Morgan passed away.
His son blamed the stress from the Pujo Committee.
That's what his son attributed it to, yeah. Wall Street showed immense respect, though.
Flags at half-mast. NYSE closed.
Yep, NYSE closed until noon that day.
And his personal net worth. There was that famous comment.
Right, calculated around $80 million at death, which sounds like a lot, but...
Compared to Rockefeller or Carnegie.
Exactly. About half of it was actually in his art holdings alone. Andrew Carnegie, hearing the figure, famously commented, "And to think that he wasn't even a rich man."
Dismissive, but maybe puts his wealth in perspective compared to the other industrial titans.
It does, but
Yeah.
Morgan's legacy, it really extends far beyond just the weight of his wallet.
The art, for instance.
So much of it donated to the Metropolitan Museum of Art after his death. And his other collections, Napoleon's watch, Da Vinci's notebooks, a 5-page letter from George Washington, just incredible stuff.
And his personal library.
Opened to the public in 1924. It remains this amazing testament to the sheer amount of influence one man could aggregate.
And despite the controversies, people respected his honesty.
Unrestrained and fierce honesty. That's how people described it. Even his arch rival, President Roosevelt, couldn't help but praise him for it after his death.
What did TR say?
He acknowledged their political opposition, but said, "Whenever I was brought into contact with him, I was struck not only by his very great power, but by his sincerity and truthfulness."
High praise from an adversary.
It really is. So what does it all mean? Morgan's story, I think, is this profound illustration of the incredible individual power that can build up in an unregulated environment, and also the massive societal shifts that happen when that kind of power finally gets challenged.
From financing, basically the Civil War, to bailing out the U.S. government twice, consolidating entire industries, J.P. Morgan's influence was just immense. Truly, such a complex character. Titan of finance, sure, but also struggled with personal anxieties, left behind this legacy of both controversy and, you could argue, salvation.
Definitely. And when we look at figures like J.P. Morgan, people who wielded such extraordinary, almost unimaginable power today, it really makes you wonder, what societal mechanisms might we need now to make sure that immense financial power serves the public good without totally stifling innovation, and who ultimately should be in charge of striking that balance?
That's a huge question, and something definitely worth thinking about. We hope this deep dive has given you a lot to consider.